Welcome back. In this lesson, we're going to talk about taxes and how taxes will impact the outcome in our market and how it affects the surplus, the total surplus in our particular market. Quick note, the type of tax we look at is a per unit tax. That often differs from the taxes you'll see. Sales tax is typically a percentage tax. The reason for a per unit class in a principles course is, quite frankly, simplicity. It's far simpler for us to do the analysis with the per unit tax. The insights we get are going to be the same as what you'll see on a percentage tax, more or less. And if you get to upper level, intermediate economics or beyond, you can go through some of the analytical exercises where you could do percentage taxes. Just wanted to note that before we get started. So, what are some of the questions? How does the tax affect consumer surplus, producer surplus, total surplus? And we introduce a new concept. When total surplus is lost, we call it deadweight loss. How is this determined, and does the tax revenue depend on the size of the tax? How does a tax matter? Right? Everybody here knows what a tax is. So when there is a tax, the way we'll think about this is now all of a sudden the amount that the buyer is paying is different than the amount the seller is receiving, right? And the amount of that difference, that's the tax. So buyer pays some higher amount, the seller gets some lower amount, the government gets the amount in between. Well, what is that going to do? What happens if you raise, as price goes up, law of demand says quantity demanded drops. As the price drops, law of supply says quantity supplied drops. Right? Suppliers are getting less, buyers are paying more. The quantity is going to decrease with the tax. And a really important point to note here, as your elected officials will often not know this point and make silly statements that aren't based in reality. The effects of the tax are going to be the same whether the tax is imposed on the buyers or the sellers. You'll often see this kind of thing. A couple of years ago, there was a discussion in it was either Illinois or Chicago, and they wanted to put a tax on the firms. So there was a discussion in Illinois, and they wanted to put a tax on the firms for the labor that they hired. And one of the politicians says, no, this is not going to be a tax on the workers. This is a tax on the firms for how much labor they hire. Well, if you make hiring a worker more expensive to the firm by a tax, it's going to have the exact same effect as if you just taxed workers for the hours that they worked. One way it goes to the firms, so a person's more costly, so they'll have to pay less. The other way it goes to the workers, so they get less. But the market demand and supply is going to fix that. The elasticities of demand and supply are going to determine who's paying what percentage of the share. So these effects are the same whether the tax is imposed on buyers or sellers. We don't make the distinction. If you want on your own as you go through this to say, let's say it goes to the buyer, now let's go to the seller. And you could do that by shifting the demand or the supply curve. You're going to find the same result regardless. So this is just a crucial point. Largely because so many of your elected leaders will not know that particular point. So what's the effect of the tax? It's typical demand and supply curve that you're used to by now, right? You could graph this out yourself. You know the equilibrium price, the equilibrium quantity. Well, the tax is going to form a wedge in between there, right? The wedge being for the size of the tax, $T per unit. Buyers pay more, right? For this quantity, buyers are going to be paying this price. Sellers, they'll receive a smaller price, right? And that difference is the amount that goes to the government. So the quantity is reduced, the price the seller gets drops, the price the buyer gets increases. Right? And this is the effect of the tax. The government gets some of that money in between. So what's the revenue then from this tax? Well, it's the area of a rectangle. So remember when we were looking at the area for surplus before, we did the area of a triangle. That's 1/2 times base times height. For those who are very rusty on their geometry, a rectangle is just base times height. You're not cutting it in half. Basically, when we did the triangle, it's like you get a rectangle, but you cut it in half. That's why you do 1/2 times base times height. Rectangle is just base times the height. So it's the quantity times the amount of the tax. Right? That'll be the revenue gained from the tax. So QT times the T dollars. Right? That's relatively simple. If you have a $100 tax and you get 20 units, what's the tax revenue for the government? 100 times 20 is 2,000. So, what do we do with the tax to try to figure out what's the benefit or cost to society if you put a tax in place? Well, remember the welfare measures we talked about before, consumer surplus and producer surplus? Now we have a little bit more to it. We have consumer surplus, producer surplus, and we do include tax revenue. And we include that completely, as if there's no inefficiency. That's something beyond the principles class you could debate, right? Is this tax so beneficial that it should count for more? Or is the government not very efficient with spending the money, so that should count less in terms of benefiting society? That's a debate that's beyond principles level to have those types of debates. For now, we just include that dollar for dollar. But then we will be looking at, is some of the surplus lost? They divide, here we divide the triangle up into 6 parts, right? A, B, C, D, E, F. This large triangle here. Without the tax, what would be the consumer surplus, right? Before I put this on here, take a moment, pause, try to figure out what's the consumer surplus if there's no tax put into place. Okay, I hope you remember from our earlier lesson that typically consumer surplus, it's the area above the price but below the demand curve. So it would be the triangle up here and include areas A, B, and C. What about producer surplus? Well, that's the area above the supply curve but below the price, ED or DEF. And of course there's no tax, so there's no tax revenue. Total surplus is this entire area, right? Consumer surplus plus producer surplus. So what happens then when you put a tax in place, right? Well, it forms the wedge. The wedge that it forms, in between here where the cursor is, means consumers are now paying this higher price. Well, consumer surplus is still the same idea. What extra value are consumers getting above and beyond the price they pay? Well, when the price was lower, you had extra consumers buying the product, so you lose C when it goes up to this higher price. But then every consumer who was buying it before was getting it for a cheaper price, so this is no longer consumer surplus. Consumer surplus is only A. Producer surplus, right? Sellers are getting less money for their product. The producer surplus was areas E, D, and F before. Now it's just area F because the price has dropped, right? They're only getting price with the superscript S, price S for suppliers, instead of the original equilibrium price. So you have fewer sellers, you lose this area E, and every seller who was there before is getting less money. And that's that area is lost with D. B and D become your tax revenue. So your total surplus, the way it's defined here, often I like to actually separate it out. You'll see it both ways. Consumer surplus, producer surplus, tax revenue, all of that's counted as the good, right? Like the total value. That's A, B, D, and F. Well, you remember from before, though, the entire triangle up here and the entire triangle down here for consumer and producer surplus will contain these areas C and D. Those are no longer included in surplus. They're just gone. Right? And if you try to think about what do we mean by it's gone, surplus, how could that surplus just be gone? When you put in a tax, you now have sales that aren't going to take place anymore. Without the tax, the quantity was at this QE. That was the equilibrium quantity. These buyers in this shaded area where you see the C and the E, you had buyers who are willing to pay more than the equilibrium, but less than this PB, right? All of these buyers on here in the demand curve, they were getting surplus. They thought it was a good deal to buy it for the equilibrium price, but with the tax in place, they no longer think it's a good deal to buy the product, so they don't buy the product. So that consumer surplus doesn't happen anymore. That's why we say it's gone. The producer surplus is this area E. That, once again, similarly, you had sellers who are willing to sell the product for the original price, not for the lower price. That's where the lost surplus. That's what we mean by the lost surplus. That lost surplus is called deadweight loss. So the deadweight loss of a tax, the fall in the total surplus that results from that market distortion. So as we mentioned, it's because of the lack of the sales. We were before having value to buyers that was greater than the cost of producing them. The sellers found it valuable, the buyers found it valuable. Why is deadweight loss important? Well, it's lost well-being to society. So the tax is preventing some trades where both the buyer thought it was a good deal and the seller thought it was a good deal. That's the reason they made the exchange. With the tax, price for buyers is higher, price for the sellers lower, you have a deadweight loss. We don't go through it here, but it's a similar analysis with a price floor or a price ceiling. Right? If you put in a price floor or a price ceiling, you're changing the price. And so remember, the quantity drops when you put in a price floor or a price ceiling, like a minimum wage. Firms won't want to hire as many workers. That drops the quantity. You have a deadweight loss because of that. So that's the similar type of analysis is going to hold if you had a price floor or a price ceiling. Okay, let's go through an analysis of a tax. Either want to jot this down in your notes quick, or you can print this from Blackboard. Print this slide from Blackboard. Let's go through an example. We have demand and supply curves. We have a market. In this example, we're saying it's the market for airplane tickets. You've got the demand and supply. Go ahead and compute the consumer surplus, producer surplus, and total surplus without the tax. Then put in the $100 tax per ticket and do it again. All right. Go ahead. I would strongly recommend that you pause this to go ahead and try this on your own before we go through the answers together. Okay, I hope you paused it. Took a shot at this. Equilibrium price, right? Or demand and supply meet, it's 200. Quantity is 100. Consumer surplus, area above the price, below the demand curve. It's the extra value consumers get above and beyond the price, right? You have some consumers who are willing to pay $300 and more for the ticket. They only have to pay $200. They're getting consumer surplus out of the deal. Others are in this area. They're not getting quite as much consumer surplus, but they're still finding value. They still think it's a useful thing to buy the ticket for $200. So what is the area? That's 1/2 times the base times the height. The base is 100, right? 100 minus 0 is the base of the triangle. The height, the tallest point in the triangle is 400. The lowest point is 200. So the height is 200, the base is 100, 1/2 times 200 times 100, $10,000 in consumer surplus. Producer surplus is the bottom area of the triangle. Once again, 1/2 times base times height. That's how we estimate the triangle. Base is 100, 100 minus 0. The height, 200. Take price of 200 minus 0 is the smallest point in the triangle. And we actually work out to the same thing here, right? 200 times 100 gives us 10,000 in producer surplus. Total surplus, the sum of the two. 10,000 plus 10,000 for $20,000. What happens if you put the tax in place? Well, $100 tax on airplane tickets drives a wedge between demand and supply, right? Where is the price buyers pay going to be more than the price that sellers receive? Well, you see the wedge right in here, 250 and 150. So what's the consumer surplus now? Well, it's dropped considerably, right? Consumer surplus is still the area above the price but below the demand curve. But this area is no longer consumer surplus, right? The price is now $250. So consumer surplus, the height's 150 because it's 400 minus 250. The base is 75 minus 0. So 150 times 75 times 1/2 gives us the area of this triangle. Producer surplus, it's actually the same measurement, right? 75 times 150 times 1/2. We have tax revenue now, right? Tax revenue, how many units are you selling? How much is the tax? Tax is $100, you're selling 75 units. So tax revenue of $7,500. Well, that gets you to a total value, or total surplus of $18,750. But if you recall, from the original analysis, the total surplus was $20,000. Our total surplus has dropped with the tax. Why? Once again, it's because there are fewer units sold, right? These individuals in this area, right? Buyers number 76 through 100 of the tickets, right? You're selling 75 with the tax. You sold 100 before. So you had 25 people who thought it was a good deal to buy the airline ticket before, when it was priced at $200, who can't buy it when the tax is in place, or can't is the wrong word, but they don't find it profitable to buy it, therefore they won't buy it. Because of those lost sales, you lose out on this surplus here. That blue area is the deadweight loss. It's the lost value to society, and that equals $1,250. Want to reiterate the point on this, on the tax, on this airline example tax. Note, we never said, is this tax going on producers or consumers? Either way, you come up with the same analysis. The government doesn't have the power to determine whether consumers or producers will pay the tax. Right? They might like that power. You might have the government that would want one entity to bear the burden of a particular tax. But that's not going to work. The markets, the demand and supply is going to determine who does that. And it's the elasticities of demand and supply that are going to do it, right? The slope of the demand curve and the slope of the supply curve will indicate who pays more for the tax that's put into place.